Hello, welcome back to the Arturia Pigments 3 tutorial series. We're in deep dive season where we deconstruct presets and figure out how this synth works. If you've enjoyed this series so far and you want a way to support my channel, have a look at the Patreon link below. That's the best way to do it. Okay, geometric, what does it sound like? It sounds like this. All of this is just a C, I'm just pressing C. Let's do something else. Ooh, it's a bit exotic. The reason it sounds so exotic is because this is a 10-tone equal temperament scale piece. So we can see in the tuning we've got 10 tet, which is non-standard. This isn't a chromatic scale. Now we've got an arpeggiator going in the background, so it's a little bit difficult to pick out individual notes, but I'll play a scale starting from C. That was A, and then I'll jump all the way up to C. I'm going to miss 2 notes out. That's the scale. So you've got 10 notes in the scale, so what do the other 2 keys do? Well, they kind of just hang around doing nothing really. If I go back to the A and play a B flat, it's just not in the scale, it's the wrong note. The B flat and the B just have no part to play. So it's a 10-note scale divided equally in the space that 12 notes would normally occupy. And that's going to give us an exotic sound. You know, this isn't something that you're going to be able to jam along to easily. This is a microtonal pattern. But what you get as compensation for not being able to jam along to it is a really cool sound. That is like so tense. That's an F. And then back down to the C again. Okay, let's figure out how this sound works. Just as in the last episode, the thing I'm going to do first is pull all the effects out one by one. And as is usually the case with effects, they're pretty easy to identify what's going on. The delay is as easy as delay ever is to identify. Completely obvious what that's doing. Let's take the reverb out. Parametric EQ, most EQs, unless they're absolutely violent, are more subtle, but nevertheless, shaping some of the mids. So you can hear it's harsher without those mids being cut. That's it for FXA, and then over on FXB we've got a wave folder with the drive turned up. So that's what it's doing. Gone, and there's nothing on the auxiliary bus, so that's all the effects turned off. Let's have a look at the sequencer. Relatively straightforward. We're in arpeggiator mode and up only. And we've got no randomization, so basically everything that's happening is in octave bounces, and you can see that there's a fair old bit of octave bouncing from +2 down to -2, so over a 5-octave range. A lot of the colour of this sound is coming from the gate length. The really sharp kind of staccato notes are coming from these truncated gates. If I really pull quite a few of them down, you can really obviously hear what's going on. And the only other thing to note before we move on is that the velocity is in fully sequenced mode, so it's not taking any of the sensitivity off the keys that are played. The entire thing is mapped manually. So again, if I pull all these down, so now regardless of how hard or soft I press the key, it's always going to play at the same volume. Note that that volume is not 0. The sound itself is modulating the volume of the oscillators. This is just the velocity control. So every time I press a key, I get exactly the same volume. Having messed with all of that, I'll throw the preset away and get us back. And what I'm going to do now is turn the sequencer off, turn all the effects back off, and then save this preset so that we can jump back to this state as often as we need to. And we call it Geo. Let's have a look at the synth. Now that we've taken the sequencer away, just before we do anything else or turn either of the engines off, let's hear the raw sound on its own. I'm just going to start spamming the C. to show you that there are tonal variations, pitched variations in the key. Even though I'm pressing the same key over and over again, something's going on to raise and lower those pitches. We'll figure out what that is. And now I'm going to turn engine number 2 off completely. So this is just the Wavetable engine, and again you hear those occasional unusual notes coming through. First thing that I'm going to do is turn the sound design tips on, because that usually gives you a good starting point to find interesting things about the preset. So our attention is being directed to the filter mix, which is set hard to F2, but the sound designer is saying, well, you might want to play with F1. And if I just turn engine 2 briefly on again for a moment, you'll see that we're being directed to the wave shapes, some modulation stuff, and again the filter mix. Okay, thanks very much. We'll get back to that later. So the wavetable is oscillating between sine wave and square wave, and you can see it toggling backwards and forwards, so something's doing that. Let's find out what it is. Well, it's the wavetable position knob. Hover over it. That tells us that function 2 is the culprit. And sure enough, wavetable 1 position, here it is. So don't forget, at the moment engine 2 is off. We don't need to worry about it. All of the references to engine 2 you can just ignore. So wavetable position 1 is being controlled by this function. And here is the function. You can see it's basically binary, either on or off. And it's fully applied, and that's why we're jumping straight to the outer limits, the sine wave right up to the square wave. That's what's going on here. If I disable that, it's going to stick on the sine wave, and that's the only one we'll ever hear. Now, there's other stuff still going on, but it's not jumping up to the square wave. This is very interesting as well. Wavetable 1 mod volume. So this is the modulator's volume. Remember that all modulators are audible level oscillators. So if I turn the wavetable down and the modulator fully up, that thing is what the modulator sounds like. So whenever this function is in high mode for these brief periods of time when the function's at its maximum, basically the modulator's being turned up. So every now and again you're hearing a pulse of sound. Now, even though we're not dealing with engine 2 at the moment, it's interesting to note that it's basically reverse polarity. So what you're hearing is a toggling of these two effects. Now at the moment engine 2's turned off, so we're only hearing half of it. And we still haven't tracked down where those unusual pitches are coming from. So if we close this view and hover over the modulator tuner, you can see that random 3 is doing something. Let's jump over there. So this is another binary control, basically on or off. Ignore engine 2. Wavetable modulation coarse tuning. So this mapped to the modulator tuning knob. The best way to catch them is turn the wavetable down again. So we'll only hear the modulator. Now I'm going to start spamming my C key, and you'll hear that they're always very sharp, very staccato notes. And they're being modulated by this 0.12, which is causing those two different pitches. If I increase this mod coarse by a different amount, you'll get a different pitch range. There's the high one, another high one, there's the low one. So you have to wait for the random algorithm to flip to the other side before you hear both pitches. So what I'll do now is go back over to the function and disable Wavetable 1 mod volume, so we never hear that, and all we're hearing now is the wavetable itself. There's the difference between the sine and square wave. Completely broken that sound. Let's get back to our preset and turn engine 2 back off. Let's have a look at the Combinator. What's this doing? Engine 1 fine by 0.01, so this is really, really tiny modulation. Let's have a look at the Combinator algorithm. Here it is, and it's a lag, which basically means it's taking its feed off rand 2, which is this shape, sample and hold, but it's being smoothed. Lag does a smoothing effect. If I turn the amount all the way down, then what you get in Combinator 1 is identical to the graph drawn in Rand 2. But the more I turn the amount up, you see it's starting to smooth those curves off. Just gets flatter and flatter. And this is modulating the tuning of the engine. So let's turn it up and hear it more dramatically. It's really obvious. Now, while we're looking at the tuning and the voices themselves, can you see that we've got a Unison Mode chord, 3 voices, and we're set to minor, so it's basically playing a minor chord every time. All these things. Let's turn this back down again. Now, bearing in mind that this is a 10-tet scale, this amount of detuning is probably quite tricky to spot, because far and away the elephant in the room is the fact that we've got 10 notes spread over an octave. But nevertheless, tiny amount of pitch variation. We just head briefly back to the sound designer's tips. It says in the comments, the mod wheel controls the chord's number of voices, while macro 3 controls the chord itself. Let's have a play of that. So at the moment my mod wheel's turned all the way down. If we have a look at the mod wheel settings, that means the voices knob is at the limit of its range, not the lowest. All of these values are inverted. So as I turn the mod wheel up, you can just, it's really hard to see, but there's a tiny blue line behind the pink zone. And now with the modulation wheel at its maximum, you're only going to get 1 voice. Now the voices come back in. And it says macro 3 is also used. Let's have a look at that. Wavetable 1 unison chord. So that's basically changing the flavour of the chord. So by default it's a minor. If I move the knob, we obviously cycle through those various chords. Every time I press a key, we get this little pulse on the filter. Filter 2 is in use here, you can see from the output screen. Remember it said have a look at filter 1? Let's do that. This is just engine 1, that's what it sounds like. But the filter modulation itself is actually controlled from the envelope VCA, you can see it highlighted. And here, in addition to the VCA amp, which is hardwired and uneditable, we've got filter 2 cut off, and that's where that's being set. Jump over to engine 2. So now all of these modulators that we've already seen, but only from the perspective of engine 1, are now doing largely an opposite thing to engine 2. So here we can see all 3 volumes of the oscillators being modulated by a pretty hefty amount, and oscillators 1 and 2 are opposite to oscillators 3 from this engine and then the mod volume from Wavetable 1. I might have misspoken earlier when we were looking at this. I think I said all of these were opposite and they're not. Now Oscillator 3, as we know, is different to oscillators 1 and 2 because it acts as a frequency modulator as well. You can see the FM mode is on. So in addition to this thing being an audible oscillator, it's also applying frequency modulation to oscillators 1 and 2. And this took me a few minutes to figure out what was going on, because you can see graphically it's clearly modulating the oscillators. And yet when you hover over the modulation knob, it says 0. I think we have to put this down to an interface bug. If you hover over a control and it says 0, it should mean it's not doing anything. In fact, it's actually on. If I turn this knob all the way up and all the way back down again, that flickering stops. And then if I right click and start increasing the control, you can see it's starting to do something. And yet I've had to move my mouse maybe an inch on the table before it actually gets past 0 and it's having a modulation effect. So what does it sound like? So there's the FM. And at these tiny levels right down at the bottom of the grid, see we've got an extra digit, 3, 2, 1, and then it's kind of 0.000 something. It is still on. So this square wave is basically maximum or minimum applying that modulation to the oscillators. In addition, you can also see the Oscillator Three's coarse control is being modulated. Let's hover over that, and this is coming from round 3. Here it is. So if I crank that up, oh, there we got one. So the reason why sometimes you have to spam the key for a little while is because there are so many of these different randomization algorithms throwing pitch variations. You need them all to align in the same direction before you hear some of these effects. Reload our intermediate preset again and hear both of those engines together. So now all of those different pitches and colours of tone, because changing a wavetable from a sine wave to a square wave isn't a change of pitch, it's a change of timbre. So you're hearing the tonal colours in addition to the pitch variations, and that means that every time we press a note, we're getting a different variation of something. Then when we bring the arpeggiator back in, you're getting the interscalar pitch variations. Otherwise everything would just be octave bounces, and it clearly isn't. Quick fly through the other macros before we call it a day. Macro 1 is assigned to Wavetable 1 phase mod. So this is basically introducing the modulator as a genuine modulator rather than a sound source. Macro 2 is increasing the envelope decay time. Don't forget, when you've got negative numbers, do the opposite of what seems intuitive. So I'm turning the time control down to make the pitches last longer. And macro 4 is the FX1 and 2 dry wet controls. So let's bring them back in. That's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed the deep dive. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much for watching.